you create over time, and it really is interesting to see and look back at all the items that you've either had to replace, repair due to a built-in design flaw, or just completely trash altogether, usually within just a few years of getting it. After about 6 years ago or so, we got a new house built, and it wasn't one of those cookie-cutter, monstrosities these corporate builders are, throwing up within a few months' time for residents. But we had one built where we didn't have to deal with any HOAs or community guidelines for what it was supposed to look like or pick from a specific set of pre-designed plans. It was completely custom, and it was finished just before COVID hit. The prices spiked, and once again, corporations and service providers panicked about the potential loss in revenue from everyone being forced into a lockdown that was only supposed to last for 14 days. You remember that? And then it turned into what? Like several months, a year? Thankfully, President Potato Head wasn't the cognitive powerhouse the media and his party and his handlers, including Binder, were portraying him to be. If he had been, we might have ended up locked into our homes under martial law like they were in China. But I digress. It honestly goes to a much bigger picture that really affects everything. When did quality and longevity become less important than quantity and faster results? We see this so much in our daily lives and just chalk it up to that's the way it is anymore. Appliances don't last as long as what they should, especially for what you pay for. Clothing doesn't last. Technology such as TVs, laptops, phones, practically anything with an internal battery has a very poor life anymore. Yet we're just supposed to accept it and follow the financial replacement plan. And vehicles are no different either. Of course, that only addresses the longevity question to an extent. But what's even sadder is the fact that, there doesn't even seem to be any consideration given to the design and aesthetic of products anymore. They do their best for what they can to fool us into thinking that the same recycled tire designs they produce are supposed to be cutting edge and state of the art. But having spent the last 20 years in the design field, I've seen so many things that decision makers thought were just so inspiring and so inventive, and just add that sizzle to the steak. That's a phrase that I have hated ever since the first time I heard it. It's so cheesy, and it's all garbage anymore. No imagination, no original thought, no creativity. And now with AI replacing so many inherent creative designers, I can only imagine the atrocities to come out of what the supposed design world is going to be and be passed off as the next decade's visual style. Anytime you go to look at something on Amazon or Walmart or Target, you see the same name brands. That's the same styles, the same marketing jargon thrown around, and you just get this feeling of overwhelming choice. But, then you kind of remember that they're probably all built in the same factory by the same people, and the only difference is how they're priced. So you buy what they want you to buy, even though the brands are all owned by the same company, but they have a different logo. Whether it's phone cases, charging cords, accented accessories, they're all made with the same level of quality and lifespan. So what pressure is there really to make a decision? I find myself standing in front of these various options, not because I can't decide which one is the best to go with, but it's just staring in amazement of how plain everything is. Colorless. It's black, white, or gray. To go with your black, white, or gray car. As I've mentioned another time, there's no imagination, no variety. I remember whenever the iPods first came out, you only had black or white. And it wasn't until the minis came out that you actually had a variety of colors to choose from. That was like the first color Apple commercial, I think, was whenever they were advertising those. Man, it's hot out here. And now it's like everything has gone back to white, black, and gray. They might every once in a while come out with a pink or a blue, perhaps, and a rose gold. but still, those are usually limited to one model or one type within that model. There's no character to design anymore. Creativity has been stripped away like it was with the older designers, back before companies were, taken over by equity firms, CEOs, and board members who had no concept of what made that company's product appealing in the first place. It's always the linear thinkers who focus on what they can take than what they can keep alive and actually continue on. And, this started way before we ever got laptops, smartphones, tablets, or desktop computers. This even goes back to motorcycles, tools, cars, furniture, and just everyday items that we use. It's interesting how we are seeing another attempt, even now, with AI trying to remove the human fingerprints on all things creative, just as mass production did the same thing to artisans, designers, fabricators, and craftsmen in various fields. I've always been a fan of classic cars. I love them, even going back to the very first Model T by Ford. It may have been simplistic, very basic by today's standards, but there was something beautiful about the functionality of an otherwise crude machine, combined with a unique exterior aesthetic, with the curvature of the fenders, the way the grille defined the front of the car, and the hood flowed into the body of the car and down over the back of the trunk, whether it was for storage or extra seating, every part of that vehicle, from the headlights to the grille to the wooden spoke wheels, the running boards, and the leather seat interior, was given so much consideration to the detail and the way it was built. Because back then, a person stood by their work, and the craftsmanship said a lot about who they were and the value of what they had to offer. You didn't have one person doing the job of 5. Later on, you had other companies who made even more impressive vehicles that still shared many of the same traits, but made it aesthetically their own. The Packards, the Rolls-Royce Phantoms, the Stutz Bearcats, the 1912 Cord 812, the kind that they had in the Shadow movie that, that's a discussion all of its own as to whether it was good or bad. The Auburn Boat Hill Speedster, and that was before you got up to the 50s with the Chevy Bel Airs and the Cadillacs with the fishtails, the early Corvettes with the dual headlights on either side of the grille, and the white on black or red two-tone color schemes. Those cars actually had room for you to work underneath the hood. It wasn't all crammed up in there. If you wanted to do your own maintenance, you could. It seems that from the 70s on, everything just became a box with 4 wheels. It was no longer a work of art. And now you look at the Cybertruck that's out, and I know it's new and it's flashy and everybody's all about that, but what even is that? I mean, it's like we're going to end up driving around in some of our worst nightmare geometry classes. You'd be driving around town, someone asks you what car that is. Oh yeah, this is my 2034 Hypotenuse Crew Cab. It's all electric. I get about 50 miles to a charge. Technology was supposed to make everything easier, but what it's actually done is has made people lazy, and that's made the design more bland and lifeless, more sterile looking. You would think with the advancements in technology there would actually be the tools to create even more variety in design, more impressive and unique products, but anymore everything looks so much more alike. Every manufacturer is copying their competition. It's like everyone is in a race to be the first that everyone else will copy, and then ride that as long as they can till everyone is bored with it. Then they just add a new camera to it and call it a revolutionary design. With greater technology, many of these companies use it to do less so that they can profit more. Of course, if people don't want to buy it, then there's always planned obsolescence. Just build in a feature that will slow it down, shut it down, or make it so cheap that it will break exactly when the company plans to have a brand new version come out. These companies know exactly what they're doing, how strong to make a part, what material to make it out of, how much weight it can withstand before snapping or cracking and compromising that piece. They gather all of this in research and development and quality testing. And it's the same thing with batteries. They know how many cycles you'll have and be able to recharge that before your device will be useless and you'll have to get another one because it'll be on life support the entire time. We were supposed to be in flying cars by now, but the most we've managed in a car design is like the obtuse scaling triangle inverted along the z-axis. It doesn't exactly sound like the kind of copy Tesla marketing would use for their Cybertruck, though. Technology was supposed to enhance creativity and design capabilities. That's at least what we saw, especially back during the Disney Renaissance when they first began adding basic CG to some of the more complex shots, like, the clock tower chase scene from The Great Mouse Detective or the ballroom dance scene from Beauty and the Beast. Those effects didn't overshadow the storytelling or the original artwork that the actual artist created and animated. It contributed and enhanced the experience without abruptly replacing the human element, those fingerprints I mentioned altogether. You take the Marvel movies now, and it's nothing but a bunch of actors walking around in great trace-marked pajamas on a soundstage with blue or green screen all around them. Now, granted, some things could not be created outside of visual effects. It's not an attack on the CG, VFX industry altogether, but still, even a set for actors to interact with is replaced by wire walls and tracking markers. And of course, with the greater technology, the more bland and recycled everything has become. There's no break, hardly anymore, to allow people to become sensitized to all of these special effects anymore, to where even outlandish stunts are just deemed as special effects or CG. The last Indiana Jones movie, or even some Tom Cruise movies, if we didn't see him promoting on a regular basis that he does his own stunts, would we even believe that that was actually him? And with the emergence of AI, I don't think a majority of people realize that everything that AI uses is actually scraped from various places. It finds media, images, audio, and even more on the web, especially with the overhyped release of, Google's VO3. Most people don't know where VO3 is getting its visual inspiration yet. If they make a clip through prompts and it doesn't come out looking right, it's probably because it hasn't scraped the right video clip or creator content yet, or that content has not actually been created by a human for it to be able to scrape from. At some point, someone is going to make an innocent little movie with this, and it will have some sort of copyrighted content, and if it makes enough profit to get a studio's attention, then that's when there will be calls for laws to be implemented with the use of AI. Or it will just be stripped from the public use altogether and available only to the elites. They'll still use it to make the movies and whatever kind of propaganda pieces they want to pay to see, but it'll still not hire back any real talent. Entertainment really isn't art anymore the way that it used to be. Going back to the craftsmanship and the visual creation of things. Just in the roles I've been in before as a 3D artist and video editor, I can't tell you how many managers, directors are always looking for ways to cut corners, do things cheaper, but still we want you to retain quality. Not that they even know what that looks like. So many companies, whether it's visual art, video, audio, even coding, they try to recycle and reuse so much of the same content that it loses the message altogether. It doesn't stand out because it wasn't made to get people's attention. It's just a means to an end, a way to maintain clicks, relevancy, a presence at the forefront for viewers' attention that will forever be fought for. There is no winning that game. No longer is art or design about the craft, the thought, the idea, the message, or a lasting impression. It's about speed, automation, numbers, anything that will correspond and please the algorithms so that you can get more and more and more content out there. No matter if it's the same as the last, no matter if it reuses the same visuals as the last 10 or 12 put out before. It's become a literal visual meat grinder. They tried to simplify it anymore to where, once again, any and every designer is replaceable. First, Adobe came out and said, anyone can be a designer for $20 a month. Then you have companies that use the same stock imagery over and over to the point where it all looks the same. And then you see their competitors using the same images. Even on TV, you watch some of the commercials and they're using music that vloggers on YouTube have used and other companies have used in their commercials. Brands would have their own jingle and music specific to their commercials that would stand out and once again leave an impression on the viewer. The Oscar Mayer Wiener song, Lucky Charms, Big Red Gum, Kit Kat, Juicy Fruit, Hot Pockets. And although it wasn't an original jingle, the California Raisins advertising for California Raisins. Now, they just pick a random image, random piece of music, and generic-looking block-style font, and send it out like they really care about their image anymore. There's no thought, there's no planning, and of course, that's just reflective of how disposable everything has been designed anymore. About 4 to 5 years ago, I took up 3D printing, and I already, knew how to model, and so it was exciting to be able to actually print things that I created myself. At first I hadn't thought much about it, but as things break the way they've been designed to, I realized in recreating a lot of those replacement parts how thin they were, how small or fragile they were designed to be, or how poorly designed they were. Of course, when you think about it and you see how much material they should have used, it's almost as though these companies in their R&D process see how much of a balance they can strike between the amount of material they can get away with for how long they want that part to last compared to the amount of money it takes to even make that part in the first place. There have been so many things I have redesigned and replaced just because that specific part was designed not to last for so long. At least probably starting in the Gen X period, but certainly during the millennial period, we just became conditioned to throw out something when it broke, and not even consider whether it could be repaired or fixed. Even now, the replacement parts that they make for these things that break, that get regular wear and tear, are almost worth a large portion of the cost just to replace the thing altogether. It doesn't make it any easier, but obviously it's still not enough. We see it even with the software. A few years ago, when they went to a subscription-only option for software, and this was Adobe, made it so that you were held hostage when using their product because everything you created with it could only be used with their proprietary formatting, whether it was .psd, .ai, .indd. You can't even own and maintain your own files anymore without having to pay regularly just for access to them. And there's not really an immediate end to these forms of sustained financial forced servitude because they've made it to where our lives are dependent on all of these things. Everything is becoming more and more like a nationwide rent-a-center, and at some point, you only have so much money to spread around to all of these. How long before the only option is to rent a car? You can only rent a house, not buy. And you can't really rent food, but these corporations will find a way around that too. Compared to the older generation that took pride in ownership and stewardship of what they bought and worked hard to be able to buy, younger generations are only being taught one thing. It's only cool to keep what you have until the upgraded version comes out. Then you go into debt trying to keep up with what society would have you buy. And of course that makes it easier to throw out design, to throw out thought and planning, because why take the time and invest in a product design that's only expected to last until version 2.0, 2.1, and so on. Older generations built things to last. we're constantly told how this world is running low on natural resources and that older generations are responsible for the world being in the shape that it's in. Environmentally speaking, however, those are the last generations to still use the tools and dishes and in some cases cars that their parents or grandparents passed down, still in the same working order and condition for decades. It's not entirely just because they took care of their things, but the things that they had were also quality made, and many things made in this country. You'd almost kind of like to think that this is a little bit more of, sign of a comeback. What's interesting is that in the last 4 years, 2020 to 2024, and especially since mass layoffs have been taking place all over the U.S., I see more and more people asking in Facebook groups, does anyone know where I can get this part fixed or replaced for fill in the blank? People looking more and more for older cars with less features that don't risk ongoing repairs because of some computer chip that has, surprise, just decided to go out. It's interesting to see that there are some that seem to be getting tired of the unspoken obligation of purchasing a new replacement part every 6 months or so. Coming from a design background, I've mostly been an Apple user because it was the best for design compared to Windows. Even I will use a Mac or an iPhone till it begins to disable itself, or it just dies altogether. But even then, you typically get about 5 to 6 years on those before you start wondering if it will start up again, if you shut it down. One thing I know I've had to start doing is taking the step of maintaining my own vehicle. Ever since COVID, labor costs have only gone up, skyrocketed, and the service has gone abysmally low to the point where it borders on dangerous. Whenever you start out paying $75 an hour for a regular service, and then it jumps to $85, $95, $110, $120, $130, $140, and a majority of that from COVID on, you think the service quality would improve. But no, bolts left loose, tubes left disconnected, and so on. Made me realize at those rates, I might as well invest in a shop manual and do the service on it myself. And I'm not just talking about an oil change, or swapping out brake pads. This is valve adjustments, brake bleeding, and replacement fluids, cable adjustments, everything a shop should do, but really makes you wonder if they ever did it at all. One thing about riding motorcycles, you hear every grind of metal against metal, how smooth you shift from one gear to another, how the brakes sound when applied. None of that is hidden. Even the sense, whether leaking fuel, burnt oil, or electrical wiring, it's all very noticeable. But when the quality is put at the back of the line, behind profits and low experience salaries, you take your life in your hands, or you leave it in some strangers only there to collect a paycheck. It would be nice if pride and ownership started to make a comeback, even if it did so quietly. This era is certainly one that will challenge people's creativity. Once again, I think, even now, people who have been deceived by the current system are having to learn to rely on themselves. Again, because they see no corporation is going to come to save them. You can have years of experience, and it makes you an expensive cost to them. You have too little experience, and you're going to be treated cheaply. As large corporations begin to show more and more of their desire for cheap labor, even in the AI they're replacing humans with, those humans will go off and do something else. But this time, they'll do it for themselves. They'll take pride once again in the ownership of something, whether it's an idea, a new product, a better product than what people have been left with, is the only options anymore. People need the chance and the push to be inventive again, not just reinvent the same old tired ideas that the founders left behind when those companies were still producing something original. The phrase building a better mousetrap has been around for a while, but anymore companies seem to scoff at that, almost like they don't want to invest the work or the time trying to improve and make something that will actually sell and last. But sadly, whether it's medicine, transportation, appliances, utilities, there's no money in an actual solution, only the problems, which is why everything is designed to fail. It's really a question of, real sustainability and longevity. True sustainability is not just in the availability of materials. And I can't help but laugh whenever people talk about how they need to save the trees, or there's a water ban, or there's not enough oil, pretty much any of the environmentalist talking points. Now, as a disclaimer, I will say I do believe that every resource we have on Earth should be used as needed. But if you need more trees, plant more trees. If you need more food, let the animals get busy. If you need more water, we've got the bodies of water that cover about 80% of the planet. On the subject of oil, no one, absolutely no one, knows how oil is actually made or where it even comes from. For years, people thought that they were from deceased animals, and more specifically, they have no clue. If you actually do a deep search, it's only theories. You have many that still think it's from ancient organic matter, because that's so specific, and it's whatever would have lived, hundreds of millions of years ago, based off of their claims, which once again, those numbers have changed every 10 years as well. Used to, it was only a few 60 to 70 million years. And just in my lifetime, it's gone up to millions and billions. Just waiting for them to make the jump to trillions. I love arguing with ChatGPT because there are always so many holes in any logical or philosophical discussion that it's very easy to trip it up and get it to contradict itself. And of course, where this topic comes up, it's no different. Now, the question of sustainability, interestingly, always seems to be dictated by governments, organizations, or corporations that own or control those resources. How many years have we been told that the oil was going to be out of supply for the last 10 years, 20 years before that, even going back to the Carter administration where they were talking about an oil shortage? Of course, that had nothing to do with their usual environmental arguments because we get more oil from other countries than we even do from our own nation. And yet, that fear and that panic caused people to line up for hours, for days, to get their car filled up. Of course, we know that's nothing compared to the toilet paper crisis of March and April during COVID. That was nearly the end of mankind, as we all know it. Of course, that was only for a couple of months. But once again, you had overbuying, you had hoarding, you even had black market sales of toilet paper. And the ignorance of those who didn't realize they were being played, they were being manipulated to buy. And next thing you know, all these corporations that deal in hygiene products and soap and masks saw one of the biggest bumps in profit in stocks, all because of fear. If these companies really did care about the environment, they would be more concerned about the sustainability of their own products and the lifespan they all have before being available to the consumer. But of course, they never do that. There's not enough product in production as needed. They flood the market with as much as they can and saturate stores with their intentionally flawed design merchandise because they know people will be forced to buy replacements at the same cost as the original until they have enough to fund their version number 2 that fixes all of those problems that they purposefully left in the initial release. It's the same thing with software. Their first version is always a crowdsourced troubleshooting release. Of course, they don't call it that. That, I think, is one of the reasons that elder millennials kind of learned to never be the first to buy the newest gadget, device, and so on, because when you do, you're essentially funding what the product should have been in the first place. But of course, they'll always have a flaw built in to the tangible objects or built into the software. Failures for most digital products. You know, we used to be able to just replace things without worrying about cost, but as everything has become increasingly more expensive and the quality has degraded even further, we're facing a decision to use what we have and make it last and repair it as best we can, buy the next thing, or in the event that it fails by design after a couple of years, then we just end up doing without. You know, that's honestly what it's coming to, because when they come out with a new phone, a new camera every 6 months to a year, and you're expected and pressured to buy it, but you haven't even recovered from the last time you purchased it, and you can't do it anymore. You can only bleed a consumer base so much before enough is enough. You know, obviously, I don't have an answer to give realistically. Anyway, I could give an answer, but these types of practices have been in use for decades, and yet every generation has just accepted it, partially because it didn't cost as much in comparison as it does today, but it was still a lot of new technology. The imagination in product development anymore is just more of the same old recycled plants, materials, and styles. You know, it's like creativity has just died, or is at least on life support. You know, it's gotten to the point where companies are now just straight up lying to the consumer about what their products can actually do or the features they have just to keep the stock moving. You know, when that happens, we can always, talk about Apple's newly promoted AI feature in their iPhone 16, which isn't really the AI that they promised. But, another thing I noticed is that this happens so much when you have new leadership that comes into a company and takes over and trashes what the original founder had established. But that's a rant for another ride.